We're in John. We are on our worksheet on the second page. I'll put my glasses on, I'll tell you where. We're going to be in chapter 9 tonight. Oh, does anybody need a worksheet? Still have about 13 or 14, all right? Anybody need one? We're going to fix you right up. So glad to see you all here tonight. This is the same one we've been using. We're moving slowly through the text of John, hitting the highlights. What are we focusing on? If you've been in this class, is it registering what we're focusing on as we go through John? Anybody? Signs. We're focusing on the signs. Where did John say in the text that he wrote about the signs for a specific purpose? Yes. Chapter 20 and chapter 21, both those texts he talks about, especially in chapter 20. It says, these signs have I recorded so that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And then when he finishes the last verse, he says, well, what does he say in the last verse? You can read it. That's not cheating. Many other signs did Jesus do, which are not written in the volume of the book, and if they were, he supposed that the world itself would not be able to contain them. So, a lot of signs. And we are in chapter 9 tonight. What we're going to do, we're going to read the chapter. I've divided it up into 6 portions, so I need 6 readers. Let's not dally about and waste time. I need somebody for 1 through 7. Corey's got 1 through 7, 8 through 12. Who will take 8 through 12? Steve has got 8 through 12, 13 to 17. Did I see another hand? Jeannie. I'm going to write that across my forehead. Well, then I won't be able to see it. You got 13 to 17, right? So that leaves 18 to 23. Who will take that? All right, Harold. 24 to 34. Bobby. And the last text is 35 to 41. Preston. Good. We're set. Let's read the 9th chapter. And what we're looking for, we're looking for the impact of a sign. The impact of a sign. All right.
As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing.
The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So when I washed and received my sight, they said to him, where is he? He said, I don't know.
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly did the mud. Now it was the Sabbath day that Jesus made the mud over his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he could receive his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet.
And the Jews therefore did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received sight, until they had called the parents of the very one who had received his sight, and questioned them, saying, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then is it that he now sees? And his parents answered then and said, we know that he is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he sees, We do not know. And who opened his eyes? We do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He shall speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. And for this reason his parents said, He is of age, ask him.
So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He asked and said, Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him again, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? They reviled him and said, You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses as for this fellow. We do not know where he is from him. The man answered and said to them, Why, this marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from, and yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, You were completely born in sins, and you are teaching us. And they cast him out.
Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? And he answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I not believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. And Jesus said, For judgment I am come to this world, they that which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him, Are we blind also? And Jesus said unto them, If you were blind, you would have borne, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see therefore your sin remain.
All right. Now, the worksheet is misleading because I've only got a couple of lines with a couple of blanks, but I want to spend some time talking about this text tonight. John 9, 1 to 41, but especially 9, 32 to 33, it is observed that if Jesus was not from blank, he could do nothing blank. If Jesus was not from God, he could do nothing miraculous. That's the observation. So, what's the implication by the observation? He is from God because he did the miraculous, and it was a sign. What is the impact of this sign? As you read through the chapter, what's going on? What do you see happening? All right? Okay, some are blowing it off, some are explaining it away. It's as if you can see the line that's being drawn, and I'm doing this. Maybe I should be drawing it this way, but the line is being drawn, and people are getting on one side or they're getting on the other, and the question is coming up, all right now, who is this guy? And here's the thing. Does anybody in the text even try to deny that a sign was done? How could they? They understand this is the guy who was blind for 6 or 8 weeks, his whole life. And this isn't a huge, massive community. He was blind his whole life. They knew that. Nobody denied that he was blind and then came seeing. What was the question that he was asked 3 times? How did he do this? Did he answer him? He answered him the first 2 times with a specific explanation of how he did it. What did he say the third time? I already told you. Do you want to be his disciples too? It was like you can just see the sarcasm, because I think this guy knew who these guys were who were asking.
Gary mentioned that there was some fear in there too, that they were losing control.
Right.
Suddenly here comes somebody in and they can't just push them aside.
So the Pharisees ask him first. Does he explain to them when they first ask him what happened? Yeah, he does. He explains it to them. Who do they ask next before they ask him again? They ask his parents. What do his parents say? He's of age. Ask him. Now, why did they say that? That's what the text says in verse 22. Hear this. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed, and they didn't just agree, they must have made it public. These folks knew that the Jews had agreed that if anyone confessed him to be the Christ, he was to be what? Put out of the synagogue. So here's the line. If you believe in Jesus, you're out. Now think about the contradiction, the irony, if you will. These are God's people. For 1,500 years, they've had his law. They've had his prophets. But here comes the Son of God, the Messiah, and they're challenging people. And it's the leaders, the spiritual leaders, if you accept him to be the Messiah, the Christ. By the way, what does Christ mean, the word? Here we go. Anointed. You're going to have to select at least one person every week to answer this question, so I'm satisfied. Christ means anointed one or anointed of God. What's the Hebrew equivalent? Messiah. All right, there we go. Yes, Preston.
I have this thought that, I know Jesus is the Son of God, and we all know the Godhead, but I just see God standing there in front of this guy, just like he was with us in the garden. He's back. He's back. He was born in a human body and he's back, and standing in front of him and saying to this guy that was blind, do you believe in me?
Mm-hmm.
He's standing right there.
Yeah.
Creator of the universe, the God, the Son of God, he was with him and all of that. And I just, we have the desire to go back to God. We want to get back with him, what we had in the garden. We had this desire, even though we don't really maybe realize it. And then here he is, and then we don't see him. But then, that was in part of God's plan too.
Sure.
That it was, he said, this is so that, I can, God's, he says what's going to happen before it happens, and then it happens, and it was planned, it was part of God's plan, but just the thought of that, it's just amazing.
It is amazing when you really think about that. And to me, when we finally find ourselves in the presence of God, we're going to be blown away. Just when things are revealed to us that we had no idea were true, and it's some great truth that we thought we should have known that for a long time, when we just find it, it's like, wow, why didn't I know that before? I think it's going to be like that with God 1,000-fold. Dayton?
It might be a little more difficult to accept Christ because of another statement or two he made in this chapter in the 5th verse. He said, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Now that's a pretty big claim.
Right.
And you can see how a Pharisee out there that thought they were the leaders
Right.
might measure that. And then he talked to this blind man in verse 35 and said, do you believe in the Son of God? And he said, of course, who is he? And I could believe it. Jesus said, the one that's talking to you is he, or I am the Son of God. So Jesus claiming to be the light of the world as long as he is on this earth. That's pretty big too. And when humans like to take to hear a statement like that, they just couldn't get around.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad, but hard to be one to accept that he is the Son of God.
Right. Well, and when he says things like, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me, it's, whoa, wait a minute. And some of them went back, they wouldn't follow him because that was a hard saying for them. Well, it's a hard saying unless you have it in mind. This is the Son of God. So whatever he says must be right, even if I don't understand it. Now that sounds like blind faith, but it's not blind faith if, for example, you're this guy. You were blind from birth. Somebody says, here, put this mud in your eyes and go wash in the pool of Siloam and you'll see. And you do that, and boom, you can see. Whoa. Now, is that a sign only to him? Obviously not. Everybody else witnessed this. They saw the power. They understood that a great thing had been done. Even if they didn't want to accept it as being from the Christ, they couldn't deny that a great thing had been done. And the thing here, it's poetic. His eyes are opened. By who? By the one who is the light. He's the true light. His eyes, his lights come on, and yet the Pharisees won't accept that. And so what does Jesus call them? They're blind. And this guy, the guy who's been blind from birth, what does he say there in the end in verse 38? I believe. This is the pattern we see in John. We see a sign, and then somewhere after that sign, we see people who are believing. John is writing this out. He's not just writing out that Jesus did the signs. He's writing out the impact that the signs had on people. This guy believed. Why did he believe? Because he knew that what had happened to him had to be of God. That's his argument to the Pharisees. And what did the Pharisees say to him? You can just hear the dripping arrogance oozing out of their statement. Verse 34. You were born entirely in sin. Oh, us? Not us. You were born entirely in sin. By the way, were they the only ones that wondered about that? Who else wondered about that? How did the chapter start off?
Either he or his parents must have sinned.
Yes. Who was that? The disciples. And when we read disciples, is it the disciples or do you think it's the apostles? Somebody who is a follower of Christ is asking the question, and I'm sure they were asking it honestly so from their perspective of what they thought they knew so far. Who sinned, this guy or his parents? The Pharisees are reflecting that same idea, that same concept that's false. And we still hold that today, sometimes. And we have to keep reminding ourselves, it's not about that. It's not about that.
Think of the book of Job. Those three ones who got around Job, they were just sure.
Right.
And he was going through all that agony because of all of the sins he had done. Somehow he'd gotten away with it.
Right. And that was their assumption, that there must be sin here. That's why he's suffering. And I think that's why God put that book in with the others and put it in so early, because that's apparently a very old book. And so we're seeing when we read Job, not all suffering comes from the sin of the person who's suffering. Don? Yeah, didn't they read Job? We would ask that question. How many times did Jesus ask the question, have you not read? And I can just, every time I read that, I'm asking myself, what is there in here that I haven't read, or that I have read and I just haven't internalized what it says or come to understand what it says? Because when he asked the question, have you not read, the implication is, you should have read this. And not only should you have read this, you should understand it by now. And he wasn't talking to 5- and 6-year-olds. He was talking to people who were claiming to be the religious leaders. And here they are telling this guy, in their arrogance, I would say, you were born in sin and you're teaching us. How dare you try to teach us? Don't you know we're high and mighty and above you, and we know so much more than you could ever know? It's like, whoa.
With that background of thought, think of how many people must have Mm-hmm. What would that have done to challenge your faith?
Right. And yet that in itself was a sign that it was an unfulfilled sign at that point, but it was a sign nonetheless when 3 days later they went to the tomb and that thing's empty. And the angels would ask, why do you seek the living among the dead? Kind of a rhetorical question. I remember a story, and it was told me as though it were true, and if it wasn't true, it could very well be true. But you know how the military stands inspection, and everybody's standing in attention, and the commanding officer was coming by, and came by this one troop, and they march in front of you, and as you're standing there, they'll do, and they'll look you all over, and if there's anything wrong, they'll tell you, and if not, they just go on to the next troop, and stopped in front of this one young soldier and said, button that pocket, soldier. And he said, right now, sir? And he said, yes, right now. What do you think? He says, okay, sir. And he reached out and he buttoned the commanding officer's pocket. It's like, oh, I had a pocket unbuttoned. I'm calling on you for having your pocket unbuttoned and mine's unbuttoned. It's like the plank and the speck. Why do you take the speck out of your eye? No, why do you take the plank out of your eye? That's it. So that you can help your brother take the speck out of his eye. So get yourself right, and you can see to get others right. And that's what this sign was for. It was so people could get themselves right with who this guy was. He's the Son of God. The observation is if he were not of God, he couldn't do this. And bingo, that's it. He is of God because he did do that. And that's what we see all through John's gospel. And John is continually presenting these signs. And it's just a little handful of the signs that Jesus did. And then he shows us that when he did those signs and people saw them, they came to faith. And yet while some are coming to faith, others are still lost in their blindness. Bobby?
It's interesting, too, that the Pharisees tried so hard to pin breaking the Sabbath on Jesus. Here he is healing the blind on the Sabbath, and, they got the food.
Yeah, really. And if you think about it, though, what are you supposed to do on the Sabbath? You're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. So here's a guy who's been blind from birth. Do you think the impact of getting his sight back gave him any more ability to rest or to be at peace? And if you were there and you realized this is the Sabbath day and we are resting because God told us to, and here is a man among us who can give sight to the blind. What a great thing this is. What a fantastic blessing. But instead, they were taking on a burden on the Sabbath day of proving that a man getting his sight back was somehow a bad thing. Imagine that. It's like the good doctor, I can't pull his name, the black doctor, the brain surgeon who ran for president, Ben Carson. It didn't occur to me to use his quote about abortion in this, but he says there's something wrong when you are defamed for defending the rights of a child. And it's not an exact quote. He worded it much better than I did. But he said that's what's happening in our country. Everything has gotten twisted around. And here's a guy who's being accused and ostracized because he's gotten his sight back. And this ought to be a great day for rejoicing. As brothers who love him and care about him, they ought to be jumping up and down, even on the Sabbath day, slowly and carefully because they're supposed to rest. But jumping up and down, wouldn't you be if you cared about this guy? Yeah. Telling you what. So that's what I wanted us to see, that here's the sign in the first part of the chapter. That sign is never denied, but it's bantered back and forth, and the forces of the world embodied in the Pharisees are trying to suppress it. Remember what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1? Those who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, they don't just deny the truth, but they suppress the truth. If you accept that he's the Christ, you're getting put out of the synagogue. Oh, oh. If you don't kowtow that the practice of homosexuality is natural and normal and ought to be accepted in all society, you're going to be ostracized. We're going to say bad names about you. You're a homophobe. You're a bigot. If you don't say that women ought to have rights to abortion and that's a right for her to handle her body the way she wants to, and the government ought to pay for that, and if you unfund Planned Parenthood, well, you don't care about women's health, and you're a no good whatever. Suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It's everything that's going on today is what's been going on. It's the same stuff. It's the same stuff. All right, observations, questions, comments. All right, let's move on then. John 10, 17 to 21. Who will read that for us? John 10, 17 to 21. Anybody? Need a reader. All right, Danae.
For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. A division occurred again among the Jews because of these words. Many of them were saying, "He has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him?" Others were saying, "These are not the sayings of one demon-possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind."
All right, thank you, Danae. John shows the reader the apparent impact of Jesus opening the eyes the blind had on some. What was that impact? I'm sorry? Okay, they believed, but, and in this case, that's true. Okay, look, what is he saying? What is his claim here? If you were there on that side of the resurrection, not this side of the resurrection, but on that side of the resurrection, what would you make of what he's saying? Wouldn't make much sense. And yet, what made them doubt the doubt in his statement? This guy just gave a guy back his sight. So if he says this, there must be something to it. And what was Jesus claiming? He was claiming, nobody takes my life. I really like this. Jesus says, nobody takes my life. Who was in control at Calvary? Jesus was. The whole time, he was in control. It wasn't the Romans. It wasn't the Jews. They arrested him in the garden, but who was in control? Jesus was. This was the plan. This was the plan. Everybody who is there is falling into the plan. Nobody's forced to do it, but they're colluding. That's a good word. We can use that now because everybody knows and is familiar with colluding. They're colluding without even knowing it with the plan of God. The Jews were. The Romans were. The apostles were. The shepherd would be struck and all the sheep would be scattered. And that's what's happening in the garden. It's God's plan. He's arrested. He's put on trial. God's plan. He's beaten. By his stripes we are healed. It's God's plan. This was God telling us hundreds of years before it happened. This is the way it's going to be. All of these things were fulfillments of prophecy. It was God's plan. When could Jesus have stopped it? At any point along the way. Now, these folks didn't know that because none of this had happened. They hadn't seen all that. But on that side of the cross, people are putting their faith in Jesus because why? They've seen the signs. They've seen the signs, and they know there's something about this guy. When the Christ comes, will he do more signs than this guy? There's something about this guy. Who can give the sight back to the blind? There's something about this guy. So if he says this, yes, he did not stop it. He didn't want to stop it. It was his plan to fulfill the will of the Father. That was his food. That's what he said. My food is to do the will of the Father. All right, did we fill in the blanks? Or did I completely, no, we didn't have any blanks. Huh. A blank-free question. How about that? All right, John 10, 40 to 42. Who would like to read that?
Before you go there,
Oh, okay.
I've got this passage I keep kind of reading over and over, and I know it's very simple, but I was just trying to think about something. It's verse 27 in John 10. If you kind of look at that, it says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." And I know that Jesus asked the blind man, "Do you believe?" And he said, and I'm struggling here a little bit.
Okay.
I almost want to say that I know it comes down to choice. Either I want to believe him or follow him or not. That's freedom of will. But then it's almost like the God knows who's going to follow him, and the God knows who's not.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always kind of had a little issue with that because of like the predetermination. The God knows who. Well, sure he does. But that doesn't take away our free will.
Absolutely.
In this little passage here, I'm struggling with it a little bit. Could you give me a little insight on that passage?
Well, my little insight is that I don't know all the details because God never says, this is the way it is with human nature. Some people are going to follow me and some people aren't. But when you read through the text of Scripture, starting with Genesis, that's what he is showing us. Here are people, there's nothing about these people. They're not born any differently than any other people. They're not instilled with demons from the get-go. They just make a choice or they don't make a choice, and that's what makes all the difference. Do you remember when God was bringing Israel into the Promised Land? He split them up. 6 tribes on Mount Gerizim, 6 tribes on Mount, what was the other mountain? Gerizim, Ebal. Was it Ebal? Whatever the 2 mountains were, and he had one group pronounce the blessings, and the other group pronounced the curses. What were the blessings and the curses based on? The keeping of the law. And so he says, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. You keep this law, here's what you're going to get. It's going to be great. And it would have been. But here's the curse if you fail to keep the law. Who chooses? Every day the same thing is set before us. Who chooses? I look back over my life and I see all the things I've done and said that I regret, and all the things I should have done that I didn't do that I regret. Nobody made me do any of that stuff. There's not a single one that I could go back to and said, you made me do that. Remember Flip Wilson? Some of us are old enough to remember Flip Wilson. The devil made me do it. Dress up like Geraldine. He wasn't a cross-dresser. He was just a comedian who did a really good job with that role. And that was his thing. The devil made me do it. Because it was funny. And we all knew the devil didn't make her do that. She's Geraldine. That's what she likes to do. So that's what we do. We do things based on our choice. Nobody makes us do anything. These people are choosing. What is it? I have asked the question myself. Don and I have had this conversation. I've said, Don, what's the difference between us and people who don't believe? Why do we choose? Is there something special about us? I don't see it. I don't know. I refuse to believe that God puts that in some people and takes it away from others, because that would not be just. And there's nothing in Scripture that leads me to believe that. Harold?
I think the parable of the soils gives me some insight into this. Some of the seed fell along the side of the road or the pathway, and the birds came and got it, which really says Satan was the one that did it.
Right.
Some people have a chance to hear it, and Satan gets it away from them before they ever have a chance to really take it in. Then there's those that are planted like on rocky soil. There's some people that hear it and they're glad, but it don't last long. But that's people. That's the way we are. Each one makes our own choice.
Right.
But there's a lot of things, I think, that influence our choices, and I personally think Satan is the big influence behind most all those things.
Absolutely. He's a lion going about seeking whom he may devour, but even at that, he can't force us to do anything. All he can do is entice us and tempt us to do things. Now, if we're willing to succumb to the temptation, then that's what gets us in trouble. What is it James says on this? James, the brother of Christ, wrote this in the very first chapter of his letter to the church. He says in verse 12, James chapter 1, verse 12, "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he's been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him." To those who love him. Remember when Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica, he said, "For those who do not love truth, God will send them a delusion." Well, that's fair. You don't love truth, I'll send you a delusion. You want a falsehood, you want a lie, you don't love truth, I'll send you a lie. There you go, boom. 13, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted," here it is, "when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. And when the lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." Now, the devil is at work, but I heard somebody make a statement once, and I fully agree with it, that we perhaps give the devil more credit than we ought, because sometimes the devil's on the other side of the world, and I'm sinning. Why? Right there it is. My own lust. All of us have that in one way or another. My lust is different from yours, but I've got the desires of the flesh in one way, you've got them in another way, and we have to decide whether we're going to allow those fleshly desires to lead us or whether we're going to allow the Spirit of God to lead us. There's the works of the flesh and there's the fruit of the Spirit. And one of those things is going to be dominant in our lives, and it's up to you and me to choose. But isn't that marvelous to have the power of choice in the presence of God and Satan? We have the power to choose which direction we're going to go. I've seen a couple of hands. I don't remember who all had them up. Bobby and Preston.
Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
The stuff that we are presented with is just rewrapped. It's like a Christmas present we like to pass around. Fruitcake, if you would. Nobody really wants it, but yet here it is. You got it, and you got to deal with it. So what the devil does.
That's a good analogy.
Hands it back to you.
Yeah. If you knew it was a fruitcake, you wouldn't unwrap it. But of course, that if I make you feel bad because you like fruitcake, I apologize. But Preston.
I was just thinking about that passage that you just read about lust. I was thinking about in the garden, sin. When we receive the knowledge of sin, and Eve's state of mind, she saw it and desired it, and saw that it would be good for food. And I was just trying to get it in my mind, would that be lust?
Mm-hmm.
That would be lust. Even though sin didn't exist yet, that was still lust.
Right. Now a desire, we have desires, and I think God wants us to have desires, because if we didn't have any desires, we'd just sit at home on the couch all day. You got to have desires, and desires for good things, and the lust comes in when our desires outweigh our standard of what's right and wrong. How many of you like pizza? Right? Anything wrong with pizza? Nothing wrong with pizza. What if you eat 3 of them? Okay, that might be a little excessive. So you see, there's gluttony. There's a desire for food, which is not wrong. Jesus fasted for 40 days, and what did Luke write? He was hungry. He wanted food. And don't you know if he had eaten, that would have been the best food? Oh, haven't you ever done that? You haven't had food for a long time, you've worked hard, you built up an appetite, and you sit down to something that you probably wouldn't eat on a regular day, and you taste it. Oh, that's the best stuff I've ever had. These are the best leftovers. Just scrape that fuzz off there. Man, that's all right. That's good. You know what I'm saying, though? That's hunger, and that's fulfilling a legitimate desire. But then there's lust that goes beyond the desire, where lust becomes gluttony. And we know there are lines, and we have to decide, okay, I'm going to discipline myself to only go this far. Because all the things that God gives us that are good, if we push them too far, they become evil. It's marvelous that he's built in us a computer that links up with him if we wanted to know that there's good and there's evil, and we can make the choice between the two. And even when we fail to make the choice, He's there to say, all right, let's reset the program. And you go, okay, thank you, Lord, I appreciate that. Another chance, second chance, third chance, fourth chance, 105th chance, 900 millionth chance. You just keep resetting and going on because that's the love of God. That's the grace and mercy of God. And he could have, in chapter 9, in chapter 10, he could have had lightning bolts coming down all over the place and blasted those Pharisees, but he didn't do that. He said, here I am. Here's my sign. Do you believe it or do you not? And we're in the 21st century, and we're reading John. And through John, God is saying, here's my son. Here are the signs he did. Do you believe it or do you not? We ready? We done? All right, Lord willing, we'll come back next week. And we'll do 2 more.